Did I ever tell you my dad ditched his fiancée 3 days before the altar in 1975? Yeah, full runaway groom. I'm Daniel. Most people just call me Dan. And this story still makes my jaw drop every Thanksgiving when Dad cracks open a beer and lets a detail slip. He was 22, fresh out of community college, working the parts counter at the Chevy dealership in our nowhere Ohio town. Back then, if you had a steady job and a pulse, people acted like you were supposed to lock it down with the first girl who batted her eyes. Enter Patricia. Patty to everyone except Dad, who never used the nickname after the fallout. She was the receptionist at the same dealership, all big hair and louder laugh. Her mom, Linda, basically cornered Dad in the break room one day with a Tupperware of lemon bars and said, "You know, Patty's been talking about you nonstop." Dad, being the polite Catholic boy Grandma raised, felt the walls closing in. Next thing he knew, he was sliding Grandma's tiny diamond onto Patty's finger in the parking lot, while the other guys wolf whistled from the bay doors. He swears he liked her fine at first: movie dates, bowling, the usual. But the deeper they got into planning, the more his stomach nodded. Invitations went out, the church was booked, and Linda started calling him son, like it was already law. Dad kept telling himself every guy got cold feet. It was just nerves. He ignored the voice screaming she talked over him, corrected him in front of his buddies, and once threw a fit because he wanted pepperoni instead of sausage on the pizza. 3 days before the Saturday ceremony, out-of-town cousins started landing at Port Columbus. Gifts piled up on Grandma's dining table, Pyrex sets, electric skillets, even a crocheted Afghan from Aunt Barbara in Florida. Dad stood in the kitchen staring at a toaster like it was a bomb. He finally marched into the living room where Grandma and Grandpa were watching Walter Cronkite and blurted, "I can't do this." Grandma dropped her needlepoint. Grandpa muted the TV. Instead of yelling, they both exhaled like they'd been holding their breath for months. Turns out they couldn't stand Patty or Linda. Grandma called them those two steamrollers in polyester. They made him promise to tell Patty face to face that same night. No. Stalling. Dad drove to her apartment above the beauty parlor, hands shaking on the wheel of his rusty Nova. He says the conversation lasted 2 hours and felt like 10. Screaming, crying, begging, threats to tell the whole town he was gay. Classic 1970s move. At one point Linda burst in, waving the wedding binder like a weapon. Dad just kept repeating, "I'm sorry, I can't marry you," until his voice gave out. He walked out with claw marks on his forearm from Patty grabbing his jacket. No group texts, no Facebook events to delete. Dad spent the next 48 hours on Grandma's rotary phone calling all 180 guests. "Hi, Mrs. Kowalski? Yeah, it's Michael's boy. Wedding's off. No, everyone's healthy. Thanks for understanding." He loaded the trunk with returned gifts and drove them back himself. Awkward handshakes on porches, forced smiles, one great uncle who slipped him a 20 for the trouble. The real kicker, Patty pawned Grandma's ring the next week. Dad only found out when the jeweler called the house asking if Grandma wanted to buy it back. Grandma told him to keep the cash. She never liked that gaudy little chip. Anyway, fast forward 30 years. I'm 25, bartending in Columbus, when Dad shows up unannounced with a woman I've never met. Turns out he'd reconnected with his high school lab partner, Susan, on one of those early Facebook things. They'd been secretly dating for months. 2 weeks later he proposed, with the exact same ring he bought back from the pawn shop, cleaned up and reset. Susan said yes in the parking lot of the same Chevy dealership, now a used car lot. Dad looked at me over his coffee and said, "Sometimes you gotta burn it down to build something real." They got married in the backyard with 20 people, paper plates, and a keg. Best party we ever threw. TLDR. Dad bailed 3 days before a 1975 wedding, returned every gift, took the heat, then married his actual soulmate 30 years later with the same ring the ex pawned.